Woodsong by Gary Pualsen, Chapter 6. Mysteries. Sometimes things happen in the woods that are not supposed to happen. Mysterious things that make the hair go up on your neck. Unexplainable, out-of-place things. I was sitting by a brush pile one fall morning. We'd been hunting mushrooms, and I had the team in a small cart tied up some distance away, when a chipmunk came out on a log at the base of a brush pile and chuckered at me. Chipmunks are very tame, and it's common to have them eat out of your hand. I was eating a cookie, so I leaned forward and held it out, and the chipmunk would come toward me a couple of inches, then go back, then forward and back, getting closer to the cookie pieces in my fingers all the time. Suddenly, a red squirrel, not much larger than the chipmunk, jumped down from the top of the brush pile, ran out on the log, and attacked the chipmunk. For part of a second, I thought she was fighting for the right to get the cookie, but I was wrong. In half a moment, she turned the chipmunk over, grabbed him by the throat, killed him, then dragged the chipmunk back down the length of the log to a shadowed place at the edge of the brush pile and began to eat him. It was so fast, so brutal, that I hadn't had time to move, and it was completely without reason. Red squirrels are not carnivorous. They eat the insides of pine cones. They most decidedly do not attack and eat chipmunks. Ever. I wanted it not to be. I wanted the cute little chipmunk to be sitting on the log, coming for the piece of cookie in my hand, wanted the red squirrel to be sitting on a limb, holding a pine nut in her hand, turning it and nibbling, not sitting back in the shadows, pulling the guts out of a chipmunk. I've never seen it before or since. One moment of stark, staggering violence for no reason, with no sense, there and gone. But I will always be able to see the squirrel looking at me over her kill, nose and front chiseled teeth and muzzle dripping blood. They're a night ghost. Some people say we can understand all things if we can know them. But there came a dark night in the fall when I thought I was wrong, and so did the dogs. We had been running all morning and were tired. Some of the dogs were young and could not sustain a long run, so we stopped in the middle of the afternoon when they seemed to want to rest. I made a fire, set up a gentle, peaceful camp, and went to sleep for 4 hours. It hadn't snowed yet, so we'd been running with a 3-wheeled cart, which meant we had to run on logging roads in open areas. I had been hard-pressed to find new country to run in to keep the young dogs from becoming bored, and this logging trail was one we hadn't run. It had been rough going. With a lot of ruts and mud, the cart was a mess, so I spent some time fixing it after I awakened, carving off the dried mud. The end result was we didn't get going again until close to 1 a.m. This did not pose a problem, except that as soon as I hooked the dogs up and got them lined out, I was running an 8-dog team. My headlamp went out. I replaced the bulb and tried a new battery, but that didn't help. The internal wiring was bad. I thought briefly of sleeping again until daylight, but the dogs were slamming into the harnesses, screaming to run. So I shrugged and jumped on the rig and untied it. Certainly, I thought, running without a headlamp would not be the worst thing I had ever done. Immediately, we blew into the darkness, and the ride was madness. Without a lamp, I could not tell when the rig was going to hit a rut or a puddle. It was cloudy and fairly warm, close to 50, and had rained the night before. Without the moon or even starlight, I had no idea where the puddles were until they splashed me, largely in the face, so I was soon dripping wet. Coupled with that, tree limbs I couldn't see hit me as we passed, almost tearing me off the back of the rig. Inside an hour, I wasn't sure if I was up, down, or sideways, and the dogs stopped. They weren't tired, not even a little, judging by the way they had been ripping through the night, but they stopped dead. I had just taken a limb in the face and was temporarily blinded. All I knew was they had stopped suddenly, and that I had to jam down on the brakes to keep from running over them. It took me a couple of seconds to clear my eyes, and when I did, I saw the light. In the first seconds, I thought it was another person coming toward me. The light had an eerie green glow. It was quite bright and filled the whole part of the night ahead down the trail. It seemed to be moving. I was in deep woods and couldn't think what a person would be doing there. There were no other teams where I trained, but I was glad to see the light. At first. Then I realized the light was strange. It glowed and ebbed and seemed to fill too much space to be a regular light source. It was low to the ground and wide. I was still not frightened. I would probably not have become frightened except that the dogs suddenly started to sing. I have already talked about some of their songs, rain song and first snow songs and meat songs and come back and stay with us songs and even puppy training songs. But I had heard this song only once, when an old dog had died in the kennel. It was a death song. and that frightened me. They all sat. I could see them quite well with the glow from the light, the soft glow, the green glow, the ghost glow. It crept into my thinking without my knowing it, the ghost glow. Against my wishes, I started thinking of all the things in my life that had scared me. Ghosts and goblins, and dark nights, and snakes under the bed, and sounds I didn't know, and bodies I had found, and graveyards under covered pale moons, and death, death, death. And they sang and sang, the cold song and the strange light. For a time I could do nothing but stand on the back of the wheeled rig and stare at the light with old dusty terror. But curiosity was stronger. My legs moved without my wanting them to move, and my body followed them, alongside the team in the dark, holding to each dog like a security blanket until I reached the next one, moving closer to the light until I was at the front, where there were no more dogs to hold. The light had gotten brighter, seemed to pulse and flood back and forth, but I still could not see the source. I took another step, then another, trying to look around the corner, deeply feeling the distance from the dogs, the aloneness. 2 more steps, then 1 more, leaning to see around the corner, and at last I saw it, and when I did, it was worse. It was a form, not human, a large standing form, glowing in the dark. The light came from within it, a cold glowing green light with yellow edges that diffused the shape, making it change and grow as I watched. I felt my heart slam up into my throat. I couldn't move. I stared at the upright form and was sure it was a ghost, a being from the dead, sent for me. I could not move and might not have ever moved except that the dogs had followed me, pulling the rig quietly until they were around my legs, peering ahead, and I looked down at them and had to laugh. They were caught in the green light, curved around my legs, staring at the standing form, ears cocked and heads turning sideways while they studied it. I took another short step toward, and they all followed me. Then another, and they stayed with me until we were right next to the form. It was a stump, a 6-foot-tall, old rotten stump with the bark knocked off, glowing in the dark with a bright green glow. Impossible! I stood there with the dogs around my legs, smelling the stump and touching it with their noses. I found out later that it glowed because it had sucked phosphorus from the ground up into the wood and held the light from the day all night. But that was later. There in the night, I did not know this, touching the stump and feeling the cold light. I could not quite get rid of the fear until a black and white dog named Fonzie came up, smelled the stump, snorted, and peed on it. So much for ghosts. In new snow, there can be no secrets, no mysteries. Everything leaves tracks. It is possible to see where the owl took the mouse when it tried to run across the snow in the night. The perfect pattern of the owl's wings feathers hitting the powder snow as the bird dropped on the mouse is there. You can see the intricate necklace pattern of tracks made by a hunting ermine as it looks for mice, going down into the undersnow cities the mice have in the swamp grass during the winter, then exploding out the top again with the kill and down again for another one. The tracks are always there, and they always tell the truth. But once I came on a clearing about 40 feet across. Dead in the middle of the clearing, a fox had taken a grouse. On cold winter nights and days, grouse make small caves in the snow to keep from freezing, and if they are caught in the caves, they can be taken. It is easy to find the holes they make when they plummet into the snow, but very hard to catch them off guard, because when they hear the sound of someone or something coming through the snow, they explode up and out in a white cloud. But a fox had taken one in its cave and eaten it. The feathers were there, the tracks of the kill were there. But there were no tracks leading out to the center of the clearing, no fox tracks around the grouse cave, nothing. No tracks leaving, no tracks coming. I tied the dogs off to a tree and took the snowshoes from the sled and spent better part of an hour trying to work it out, moving around in the new snow. There were no fox tracks anywhere in the neighborhood. I moved out in larger and larger circles and could find no fox tracks, no sign that a fox had come from anywhere or gone anywhere. The more I looked, the less I could find. There could not have been a fox, simply could not have been one, and yet there was, somehow, one fox, one grouse, in the middle of the clearing, and nowhere else on earth. A quick death, a handful of feathers, then nothing. Cedar waxwings, small, cardinal-like birds that are largely gray, come in the first part of spring. You'd think that over the thousands, perhaps millions of years they have been migrating, they would have worked it out to arrive in the North Country at the right time, but they always come early, while there is still snow and no real food for them. When we see them coming in small flocks, we put out suet for them. They hit the kennels and steal meat, but they would rather have berries and seeds. High bush cranberries taste, according to my grandmother, like somebody's old socks. Perhaps they aren't that bad, but they do smell awful when they're cooked, and it takes a lot of sugar to make high bush cranberry jelly worth eating. Maybe because of the way they taste, the berries are rarely eaten by game early in the fall when they become ripe. They freeze and hang beautifully red and luscious looking for the whole winter. The color truly is wonderful against the snow. The grouse start to eat them as the winter wears on, and they care less about the taste. The berries are still there in the spring, still frozen, and I happened to be sitting near a high bush cranberry stand when a flock of cedar waxwings arrived one spring afternoon, and that is where I saw another mystery that haunts me. I had always thought of birds as not terribly intelligent, although hawk did much to change my mind. I never thought of them as counting or paying much attention to each other. But the cedar waxwings didn't just descend on the tree willy-nilly. There was great order as they settled in rows on the limbs. 8 or 10 birds in each row. Then the bird closest to the berries in each row would take a berry carefully and hold it out to the bird next to him in his beak. That bird would take the berry and turn and pass it on to the next, who would take it and turn and give it to the next, and so on until the bird at the end got the berry. Then the first bird would take another berry and pass it on, and so on, until each bird in the line was holding a berry. When each bird was holding a berry, they all faced front and ate them, working the pulp off until they had the meat and spitting out the center pit. Then they would start over. My wife says it's because they hate the taste of the berries and pass them on hoping to get a sweeter one. And of course, there aren't any. They're all sour. But she's just guessing, and I still do not know why they do it. The doe was something that I could not believe, even when I saw it. It happened on a night run. It had been cold, but not deep cold, between 20 and 30 below at night, and very still. I was thinking of summer because my feet were cold. My toes had been frostbitten, and they got cold easily. Thinking of summer, or Jamaica, or the inside of a red stove helps. I was thinking specifically of 2 summer incidents involving deer, one indescribably sweet, and the other funny in a painful way. Both times, I had been fishing in a canoe. There is something about canoes, they do not cause fear. It is possible to paddle gently up to many wild animals, and they simply stand and watch. This same thing happens often with dog teams. The silence is probably the cause, but there is grace to a canoe, or a dog team, or a sailboat, which whales allow close to them. A gentle elegance that seems to fit much more into nature than the roar of an outboard or snowmobile. Perhaps for that reason, in many states it is illegal to hunt from a canoe, deemed unfair, and the same law should apply to dog teams. One early summer, we had friends visiting from the city. I took the man and his 4-year-old son out in the canoe to work some crappie beds. This morning, the crappies were best and close to shore, and we caught 7 or 8 good ones by hanging right on the edge of the lily pads and casting out to the deeper side. The water was very shallow where the canoe floated, not over a foot deep, and the man and I were busy fishing while the young boy, who couldn't cast yet, was having more fun hanging a lure over the shallow sides and watching the dozens of small sunfish come to it and nibble. It was so still, the water looked plated with the sky, and absolutely quiet except for a loon that let go once in a while before diving with the high, kneeing wail and whoop that is so wonderfully soft and melancholy. I was just working my lure in close to the boat when I heard the boy giggling quietly, and I turned to see him reaching out to touch a fawn. She was new, maybe 2-3 weeks old, still red with the camouflage spots. She walked out into the water slowly, one careful step at a time, and stretched her nose to touch the finger the boy was holding out, as if they were old friends. It was very deliberate. A youngster meeting another youngster, and I was afraid to breathe, lest the moment be broken. I looked up quickly to signal the father, but he was seeing it already. His eyes were shining with it, and the moment hung in silence. A moment so incredible, and all the moments there are, that it seemed magic, staged. When they had touched, the fawn turned and walked slowly back up into the hazel brush, where I could now see the mother, frantic with worry, trying to get her baby to come back. And then it was done. Silence for a long time. Even the small boy was silent. Finally I coughed. "It's all part of Disneyland of the North," I said. "The fawn comes out on the rail, and you touch it, and it goes back." But it was not time for jokes, and I let it fall. We just sat for a time, watching the hazel brush where the fawn and mother had disappeared, and I had one long, intense moment of gratitude that is still going on, gratitude that I have seen such a thing. The second time I was canoeing down a flat, winding river that cuts through the woods like a sluggish snake. I had gear in the canoe for a week, and I was trying to catch a muskie so I could let it go. I do not understand why I was doing this either. I have never caught a muskie so I could let it go, though I have tried for several thousand casts, and have to a large degree stopped trying to catch a muskie so I can let it go. It seemed almost a vision quest for a time. But it's fading now as I get older, and the muskie I didn't catch gets bigger, while the muskie I did catch, none, gets smaller. It was an incredibly hot day. A late August sun seemed to boil the river, and the deer flies and horseflies were not to be believed. I've never seen them worse. It must have been a peak in their cycle. They formed a thick cloud around the canoe so that at times it was impossible to even see the bank. They all bit hard, and the blood smell from the bites brought more of them. They drank repellent like Kool-Aid, licked it off, and took more. I tried lighting a smudge in a tin can in the middle of the canoe as I paddled, which worked for mosquitoes, but it didn't bother the flies at all. They just kept eating, and soon my exposed arms and face and hands were bloody. By accident, I discovered a partial solution. The canoe slipped into the shade under some overhanging cedars, and as if by design, some of the flies moved away, back out into the sun to fly along and wait for me to come out again. In this manner, I moved down the river, grabbing shade close in when I could. I was sliding under a leaning cedar when suddenly there was a tremendous crashing sound to my right. I hardly had time to turn when a doe launched herself from the thick brush on the bank in a magnificent arc that carried her out and up, higher than my head, to crash into the shallow water near the bank. Even in the split second of the event, I could see the flies. They were horrendous. A thick mass of them on her head, a swarm trailing back like a comet's tail as she flew through the air. Flies packed into her ears, into her eyes, flies to drive her mad, insane, temporarily blind. She had no idea I was there. She landed so close, she drenched me with water, but in her mad run she left the bank blind, wanting to only get in the water and away from the maddening flies. She jammed her head underwater and slammed it viciously back and forth in a swirling motion, then raised it. She snapped it out of the water and was looking straight into my eyes from a distance of 4 or 5 feet. Everything, breath, heart, everything, was absolutely still. Even the flies seemed to stop. I've never seen such anger, such defiance compressed in a single moment. The flies had taken her beyond control, and when she saw me, her eyes opened wide in surprise, then seemed to narrow in cold rage. She didn't care that I was man, the enemy, didn't care that I was there, that she was only an arm's reach away. She didn't care about anything right then except the flies. Her eyes, her manner, all things about her, for that moment, seemed to say, "Mess with me, and you're a dead man." Raw, irritated, frustrated, ripping fear. I didn't move, and in that very short time she realized what I was, blew out of the water in a fountain of spray and bottom mud, and she was gone. I thought of her now on the cold night, remembered the wonderfully hot sun cooking down on my back as I paddled. Even the flies seemed to be from the warmth somehow. Musing, lost in the scene, I did not notice that the dogs were slowing and had stopped until my stomach rammed into the handlebar of the sled. "Pick it up," I said, which usually snapped them into motion, but this time they didn't move. The leader whined in unease, and the 2 wheeled dogs, the dogs pulling directly in front of the sled, turned and tried to climb back onto the sled. With their motions, several of the other dogs began to growl, and I felt the nervousness come back from the dogs and into me. They acted this way before, usually when they'd run into a moose in the dark. We had been attacked by moose on a few occasions, and it was not something I wished to do again. Moose are large and essentially insane, with an almost pathological hatred of the dogs, the sled, the musher, trees, trains, cars, and everything else as near as I can figure. When they come at you, it's like getting run over by a Buick with legs. I wished I was some other place. The nervousness of the team increased, and I knew I would have to deal with it. So I set the snow hook and walked up alongside the dogs, flashing my headlamp ahead, trying to see around the slight curve to the lead dog. He was stopped in the middle of the trail with all his hair up, his lips barred, growling low in his throat. Ahead of him, slightly to the side of the trail, stood a doe. She was absolutely still, looking straight ahead over the dog. None of this made sense. Number one, a deer would not stand so still that close, 4 or 5 feet to a dog. Number two, the dog would not normally have hesitated. He would have been on the deer or tried to get at her, and all the other dogs would join in. You never move so fast on a run as when a deer jumped out in front of the team and bolted down the trail. They fairly flew trying to catch it. And here all of them were whimpering and cowering, spooked by one doe, who was standing absolutely still. And I was spooked by her. She stood staring across the dogs as if they weren't there. I pushed the dog sideways on the trail and made my way slowly to the front, closer to the deer. There weren't 3 feet between her and the lead dog, who was still whining, and still she did not move. Finally, I stood so close I could touch her. The light from my headlamp hit her eyes. They were fogged with death. I could see that she was dead, standing dead in the night wind next to the trail, guarding the winter night. She had frozen solid on her feet, exactly as if she were alive, perfectly still and upright. It could not be, yet it was. I looked for many things in my mind to explain it. A sudden heart attack, freak paralysis. I tried to think of all the possibilities, but it still did not make sense, and we could not stay. I could not bring myself to go closer to her, and when I pulled the leader forward and lined him out on the trail and pulled on the hook, the team shot past the dead doe without looking up, staring at the ground, not barking or lunging to get at her, but moving as fast as possible, moving away from that place.